My mother-in-law stood at the head of the dining table and said I owed the family $1,200 a month in rent, or I could watch her 5 children every weekday instead. No negotiation. She said this in front of 17 people at Sunday dinner. Her voice was calm. She smiled when she said it. My husband looked at his plate. I smiled back at her. I stood up. I pulled out my phone. I said, "Everyone should know that I already own this house. Some people in my family still think I went too far. I need you to tell me." Her lawyer called me 3 days later. That part comes in a minute. First, the room. The dining room had 2 long tables pushed together, candles down the center. My mother-in-law had made a roast. My sister-in-law brought wine. Everyone was talking over each other the way they always did at these dinners. I was sitting between my husband and his youngest brother. I had been quiet most of the meal. I was always quiet at these dinners. My mother-in-law stood up to make her announcement during dessert. She tapped her glass with a fork. She waited until everyone stopped talking, then she said it. The room went silent. My husband did not look at me. His brother shifted in his seat. I could feel everyone watching. I set down my fork. I stood. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened the file I had saved 2 months earlier. I turned the screen toward her. I said it once. Then I left. Let me tell you how we got here. I met my husband when I was 26. He worked in finance. His family had money, not extreme wealth, but enough that they never worried. His mother owned the house we lived in. She bought it years before we got married. She told us we could live there while we saved up. She said it would help us get started. I thought that was generous. I was wrong about what she meant by help. His mother liked control. She had opinions about how I kept the house. She had opinions about my job. I worked in sales at the time. She did not think it was stable. She told me more than once that I should look for something more secure. She meant something smaller, something quieter, something that would not take attention away from her son. I did not argue with her. I smiled. I thanked her for her advice. I went back to work. Her younger sister lived 4 blocks away. She had 5 children under the age of 12, 3 boys, 2 girls. The oldest was 11. The youngest was 3. She homeschooled all of them. Her husband traveled constantly for work. She was overwhelmed. My mother-in-law helped her during the week. She watched the kids 2 or 3 days a week. She paid for groceries sometimes. She paid for activities. My sister-in-law did not work. She did not have income. My mother-in-law reminded her of this regularly. At a family dinner 6 months after we moved into the house, my mother-in-law announced that she was tired. She said watching 5 children was exhausting. She said she had done her part. She looked at me when she said it. She said, "You are home during the day sometimes. You could help." I was not home during the day. I worked 50 hours a week. I told her I had meetings most days. She waved her hand. She said, "Sales is flexible." I did not correct her. I called my attorney that week and asked what my options were if I wanted to buy property without my husband knowing. The family assumed I made $30,000 or $40,000 a year. I never told them otherwise. My mother-in-law once said to me at a birthday party, "It must be nice to have a little job to keep you busy." I was closing a deal that week worth $67,000 in commission. I smiled. I said, "It keeps me busy." She patted my hand. I went home that night and signed a contract with a client in Denver worth 3 times what my husband made that quarter. I kept my finances private. I had my own accounts. My husband and I split household expenses. He paid more because he thought he made more. I let him think that. It was easier. His family did not ask questions about money. They assumed they knew. My mother-in-law told me once that I was lucky to have married into a family that could take care of me. I was sitting in her kitchen. She was making coffee. She said, "You do not have to worry about much now." I thanked her. I had just transferred $80,000 into a separate account that morning. My husband did not know how much I made. He knew I did well. He did not know the numbers. I did not lie to him. He did not ask. We kept our finances mostly separate. He paid the mortgage on a condo his mother helped him buy before we met. I paid for groceries and utilities in the house we lived in. His mother never charged us rent. She said it was her gift to us. I believed her for the first 2 years. Then she started talking about the future. She talked about how the house would stay in the family. She talked about how she wanted to make sure it went to the right people. She meant her son. She meant my husband. She did not mean me. She said this at Thanksgiving. She said, "When I am gone, this house will make sure my children are taken care of." I was sitting at the table. She looked past me when she said it. I went to see a real estate attorney 2 weeks later. His name was Martin Cross. He had an office downtown. I told him I wanted to buy a house without my husband knowing. He asked why. I said I wanted options. He said that was reasonable. He asked if I had the cash. I said yes. He asked how much I was thinking. I said 600,000, maybe more. He leaned back in his chair. He said, "You are not who I expected when you walked in." I started looking at properties in January. I looked at 12 houses over 3 months. I did not tell anyone. I scheduled showings during work hours. I told my husband I had client meetings. That was not a lie. I had client meetings. I also had showings. I found the house I wanted in March. It was 10 minutes from where we were living. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a backyard. The asking price was $570,000. I offered $550,000. They accepted. I closed on the house in April. I paid cash. My husband did not know. His mother did not know. No one in the family knew. I hired a property management company to rent it out. I told them I wanted a 1-year lease with good tenants. They found a family in 2 weeks. The rent covered property taxes and maintenance. I did not need the income. I wanted the house occupied. I wanted it working. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you already know what that silence feels like. My mother-in-law brought up the rent idea in June. She did not call it rent at first. She called it contribution. She said my husband and I had been living in her house for 3 years. She said it was time we contributed to the upkeep. She said $400 a month would be fair. My husband agreed immediately. He did not ask me. He told me that night after dinner. He said, "Mom thinks we should start helping with the house." I said, "How much?" He said, $400 a month. I said, "Okay." I paid it for 2 months. Then she raised it to $800. She said property taxes had gone up. She said utilities were higher. My husband paid half. I paid half. I did not argue. I opened a separate folder on my laptop that night. I labeled it evidence. I started saving every receipt, every text message, every email about the house. Her sister's husband took a job overseas in July. He was going to be gone for 6 months. My sister-in-law panicked. She could not manage 5 children alone. My mother-in-law told her she would help more. Then my mother-in-law called me. She said, "I need you to watch the kids on Tuesdays and Thursdays." I said I had work. She said, "You can move your schedule around." I said I could not. She said, "This is family." I said I would think about it. I called my attorney. I asked him what it would take to buy my mother-in-law's house out from under her. He laughed. He said, "You are serious." I said yes. He said, "Do you know what she owes on it?" I said no. He said, "Find out." I found out 3 days later. My husband had the paperwork in his office. He kept everything his mother gave him in a file cabinet. I waited until he went to the gym. I opened the cabinet. I found the deed. The house was paid off. She owned it outright. The property was worth approximately $790,000. I called Martin. I said, "She owns it, no mortgage." He said, "That makes it harder." I said, "How much harder?" He said, "You would need to make her an offer she could not refuse or wait until she is motivated to sell." I said, "What if I make her very motivated?" He was quiet. Then he said, "I am not sure I want to know what that means." I said, "I am going to keep paying her rent. I'm going to keep smiling, and I am going to wait until she pushes too far." She pushed too far in August. She announced at a family barbecue that my sister-in-law was moving into the house with us. She said it would only be for a few months. She said the 5 children needed stability while their father was overseas. She said we had the space. My husband looked at me. I looked at him. I said, "We need to talk about this privately." My mother-in-law said, "There is nothing to talk about. It is my house." I smiled. I said, "You are right, it is your house." I went inside. I called Martin. I said, "I want to buy her out, make the offer." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Make the offer." He said, "How much?" I said, "Market value, $790,000, all cash, 30-day close." He said, "She is going to ask why you want it." I said, "Tell her I am an investor. Do not tell her who I am." He said, "This is aggressive." I said, "She is moving 5 children into my space without asking me. I am being generous." Martin made the offer through a shell LLC I had set up in May. The LLC was called Clearwater Properties. It was registered in Delaware. My name was not on anything public. The offer went to my mother-in-law in late August. She called my husband the same day. She was excited. She said an investor wanted to buy the house. She said they were offering $70,000 over what she thought it was worth. My husband said, "Are you going to take it?" She said, "I do not know. Where would you live?" He said, "We will figure it out." She said, "Let me think about it." She thought about it for 2 days. Then she called me. She said, "I got an offer on the house." I said, "Congratulations." She said, "I am not sure I should take it." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because you and my son live here. I do not want to displace you." I said, "We will be fine." She said, "Where would you go?" I said, "We will find something." She said, "Rent is expensive right now." I said, "We will manage." She rejected the offer. Martin called me. He said, she said no. I said, raise it. He said, to what? I said, 850,000. He said, that is 60,000 over market. I said, I know. He said, you are going to overpay to prove a point. I said, I am going to pay what it takes to get her out of my life. He submitted the revised offer the next day. She accepted it in September. The close date was set for October 15th. She told the family at Sunday dinner. She said she was selling the house. She said it was a good financial move. She said she was going to buy a smaller place and have money left over. She said my husband and I would need to find somewhere to live by mid-October. My husband was calm. He said, we will start looking. I said nothing. I already knew where we were going. My mother-in-law started planning immediately. She looked at condos. She talked about downsizing. She talked about how much simpler her life would be. She was happy. My husband was stressed. He started looking at rentals. Everything in our area was expensive. He found a 2-bedroom apartment for $2,000 a month. I said, that is fine. He said, it is smaller than what we have now. I said, we will make it work. He signed the lease in late September. Then my mother-in-law changed her mind about my sister-in-law. She decided the kids should not move into our house. She decided they should move into her new condo with her. She told my sister-in-law this at a family dinner. My sister-in-law cried. She said, I cannot manage 5 kids in a 2-bedroom condo. My mother-in-law said, you will have to figure it out. I sold the house. My sister-in-law looked at me. She said, can they stay with you until their dad gets back? I said, we are moving into a 2-bedroom apartment. She said, just for a few months. I said, there is no space. My mother-in-law stood up. She said, you are being selfish. I said, I am being realistic. She said, family helps family. I said, I agree. That is why I have been paying you rent for a house you were about to sell. She froze. My husband looked at me. She said, that was for upkeep. I said, you are clearing over $800,000 on the sale. I think the upkeep is covered. The closing happened on October 15th. I was not there. Martin handled it. The buyer was Clearwater Properties. The seller was my mother-in-law. She deposited $850,000 into her account that afternoon. She called my husband. She said, it is done. He said, congratulations, Mom. She said, I am taking you all to dinner to celebrate. I said I had a work event. I did not have a work event. I had a meeting with my attorney and my accountant. We were finalizing the transfer of the deed from the LLC into my name. My mother-in-law planned the family dinner for the following Sunday. She wanted everyone there. She invited 20 people. She rented a private room at a restaurant downtown. She paid for everything. She was celebrating. She gave a speech before the meal. She talked about new beginnings. She talked about smart financial decisions. She talked about how selling the house gave her freedom. She did not mention that she had made my husband scramble to find an apartment in 3 weeks. She did not mention the rent I had paid her. She just smiled and raised her glass. Dinner was fine until dessert. That is when she stood up again. She tapped her glass. She said, I have been thinking about how to help my sister. Everyone looked at my sister-in-law. She said, I know things have been hard with your husband overseas. I know managing 5 kids is overwhelming, so I have a solution. She looked at me. My stomach dropped. She said, you are going to help watch the kids during the week. 2 or 3 days. Maybe more if needed. I said, I work full-time. She said, you have flexibility. I said, I do not. She said, then we need to talk about your living situation. I said, what living situation? She said, you have been living rent-free in my house for 3 years. My husband said, Mom, we have been paying you. She waved her hand. She said, $400 a month is not real rent. Real rent in this area is $1,200, maybe more. I felt everyone at the table watching. She kept talking. She said, so here is what I think is fair. You can help with the kids during the week, or you can start paying me $1,200 a month retroactively for the last 3 years. I said, retroactively for a house you just sold? She said, you owe this family. You have been living off us long enough. My husband said, Mom, stop. She ignored him. She said, I am not trying to be harsh. I am trying to be fair. You benefited from living in that house. Now it is time to contribute. I stood up. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened the file. I turned the screen toward her. I said, I bought the house. I own it. Clearwater Properties is my LLC. You sold your house to me. I have owned the property you are talking about since October 15th. The room went completely silent. My mother-in-law stared at the screen. My husband said, what? I said, I bought it. The investor was me. You just sold me your house for $850,000. My sister-in-law said, you are lying. I said, the deed transferred into my name yesterday. Martin has the paperwork if anyone wants to see it. My mother-in-law sat down. Her face was white. She said, "Why would you do that?" I said, "Because you kept threatening to displace us, because you kept holding the house over our heads, because I was tired of hearing about how much we owed you." I looked around the table. I said, "Everyone in this room has heard her say we were living off her generosity, so I bought the house. Now there is no generosity, there is no debt, there is just a transaction." My husband said, "You bought a house without telling me?" I said, "Yes." He said, "When?" I said, "I closed in April. I rented it out until last month, then I bought this one in October." He said, "With what money?" I said, "My money." He looked at his mother. He looked back at me. Said, "How much do you make?" I said, "More than you think." I left the restaurant. I did not wait for anyone to respond. I got in my car, I drove to the house I had bought in April. My tenants had moved out in September. The house was empty. I walked through it. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, hardwood floors, a backyard. I sat on the floor in the living room. I called Martin. I said, "Her lawyer is going to call you." He said, "I know." I said, "Are we clear?" He said, "Completely. The sale is final. She cannot undo it." I said, "Good. I am going to stop there for now. Part 2 drops next, and that is where everything I just described gets used. Every document, every number, every conversation. Stay right here." Her lawyer called me on Monday morning. I was at my desk. I had 3 client calls scheduled that day. I answered on the second ring. She said, "This is Patricia Hoffman. I represent your mother-in-law. She would like to discuss the property sale." I said, "There is nothing to discuss. The sale is final." She said, "She believes there was undue influence." I said, "She accepted an offer that was $60,000 over market value. She had her own attorney review the documents. She signed willingly." Patricia was quiet. Then she said, "She is very upset." I said, "That is not my problem." She said, "She is threatening to sue." I said, "On what grounds?" She said, "She is still working that out." I said, "Tell her to call Martin Cross if she has questions. He handled the transaction." I hung up. I want to know if you would have said what I said next, because I still think about it. My husband came home that night and asked if we could talk. I was in the kitchen. I was making dinner. He sat at the table. He said, "My mom is devastated." I said, "I know." He said, "She feels like you tricked her." I said, "I made a fair offer. She accepted. That is how real estate works." He said, "You did not tell her it was you." I said, "I was not required to." The LLC is a legal entity. The sale was legitimate. He said, "It feels dishonest." I said, "What feels dishonest is charging your son rent for 3 years and then selling the house without giving him time to prepare." He was quiet. He said, "She gave us 3 weeks." I said, "She gave us 3 weeks because she wanted the money fast. She did not care where we ended up." He said, "Where did you get $850,000? I said, "I have been saving for years. I have been working in sales for a decade. I am good at my job." He said, "How good?" I said, "Good enough to buy 2 houses in 6 months." He stared at me. He said, "2 houses?" I said, "I bought the rental property in April. I bought your mother's house in October. I own both." He said, "Why did you not tell me?" I said, "Because you would have told your mother, and she would have found a way to ruin it." He did not argue. He knew I was right. He said, "What are we supposed to do now?" I said, "We are going to move into the house I bought in April. The lease on the apartment does not start until November. I will break it. We will live in the house I own. Your mother will have her money. Everyone gets what they want." He said, "She does not want money. She wants control." I said, "She does not get that anymore." My mother-in-law called me Wednesday. I did not answer. She called again Thursday. I did not answer. She sent a text Friday. "We need to talk about this like adults." I texted back, "There is nothing to talk about. The sale is complete. You have your money. I have the house." She wrote, "You humiliated me in front of the entire family." I wrote, "You tried to charge me retroactive rent for a house you were selling. You told me I owed you. I disagree." She wrote, "I raised my son to be better than this." I wrote, "Your son did not buy the house." I did. I did not hear from her again until the following Sunday. She called another family dinner. She texted everyone in the family group chat. She said it was important. She said everyone needed to be there. My husband asked if I was going. I said yes. He said, "Are you sure that is a good idea?" I said, "I am sure." He said, "She's going to confront you." I said, "I know." He said, "What are you going to say?" I said, "The truth." The dinner was at her new condo. She had closed on it the week before. It was smaller than the house. 2 bedrooms. 1 bathroom, a galley kitchen. She had invited 14 people. My sister-in-law was there with all 5 kids. My husband's brother was there, his wife, 2 cousins, my mother-in-law's sister. Everyone was crowded into the living room. There were not enough chairs. Some people were standing. The kids were loud. My mother-in-law was in the kitchen. She was making appetizers. She smiled when I walked in. It was not a kind smile. She waited until everyone had food. Then she stood in the center of the room. She said, "I want to talk about what happened 2 weeks ago." Everyone stopped talking. She said, "Some of you know, some of you do not. I sold my house in October. I thought I was selling it to an investor. It turns out the investor was my daughter-in-law." She looked at me. She said, "She hid behind a fake company. She did not tell me it was her. She let me sell my house without knowing who was buying it." My husband's brother said, "Why does that matter?" She said, "Because if I had known it was her, I never would have sold." He said, "But you got a good price." She said, "That is not the point. The point is she deceived me. She made me look foolish. She embarrassed me in front of my family." My sister-in-law said, "How did she embarrass you?" My mother-in-law said, "She announced it at dinner. In front of everyone, she made it seem like I had been tricked." I said, "You were not tricked. You were paid $60,000 over market value. You accepted the offer. You signed the documents. You had an attorney." She said, "You should have told me it was you." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I deserved to know." I said, "You deserved a fair offer. You got one. Who made the offer should not matter." She said, "It matters to me." I said, "Then you should have asked more questions before you signed." She said, "I trusted the process." I said, "And the process worked. You got your money, you bought this condo, everything is fine." She said, "Everything is not fine. You have been lying to this family for years." I said, "About what?" She said, "About who you are, about what you do, about how much money you make. You let us all think you were barely getting by." I said, "I never said I was barely getting by. You assumed that." She said, "Because you acted like it." I said, "I acted like someone who did not need to prove anything to you." My husband's brother said, "How much do you make?" I said, "Enough." He said, "Enough to buy 2 houses?" I said, "Yes." My sister-in-law said, "2 houses?" I said, "I bought a rental property in April. I bought your mother's house in October. I own both." She said, "With what money?" I said, "Money I earned. I work in sales. I have been doing this for 10 years. I am very good at it." My mother-in-law said, "You have been hiding this from us." I said, "I have been keeping my finances private. That is not the same as hiding." She said, "You let my son think he was supporting you." I said, "Your son and I split expenses. He never supported me. We supported each other." She said, "He did not know you were making more than him." I said, "He never asked." My husband said, "Mom, stop." She ignored him. She said, "You owe this family an apology." I said, "For what?" She said, "For lying, for deceiving us, for making me look like a fool." I said, "I did not make you look like a fool. You made yourself look like a fool when you tried to charge me retroactive rent for a house you had already sold." The room went silent. My sister-in-law said, "What?" My mother-in-law said, "That is not what happened." I said, "That is exactly what happened. You stood up at dinner 2 weeks ago and said I owed you $1,200 a month for the last 3 years. You said I had been living off the family. You said I needed to pay up or watch 5 kids during the week. You said this in front of 17 people, so I told everyone the truth. I told them I already owned the house. I told them you had just sold it to me. I told them there was no debt." My mother-in-law's face turned red. She said, "You twisted my words." I said, "I repeated your words." She said, "I was trying to help my sister." I said, "You were trying to control me. You have been trying to control me since the day I married your son. You tell me my job is not stable. You tell me I should contribute more. You tell me I owe the family. You do this because you think I need you. I do not need you. I have never needed you. If you are still here, hit like. I need to know you saw that." My husband's brother stood up. He said, "This is getting out of hand." I said, "This got out of hand 3 years ago when your mother started charging us rent and then raised it every few months without warning." He said, "She needed help with the house." I said, "She owns this condo outright. She has over $800,000 in the bank from the sale. She does not need help, she needs control." My mother-in-law said, "How dare you?" I said, "How dare you act like I owe you something when I have paid you thousands of dollars for a house you did not even own anymore?" She said, "I owned it when you were living there." I said, "And I paid you for that, $400 a month, then $800. Then you wanted $1,200 retroactively. That is extortion." Said, "That is not extortion, that is fairness." I said, "Fairness would have been telling us you were selling the house before you accepted the offer. Fairness would have been giving us time to find a real place to live instead of 3 weeks. Fairness would have been not announcing at a family dinner that I owe you money I do not owe you." She said, "You do owe me. I gave you a place to live." I said, "You charged me for it. That makes it a transaction, not a gift." My sister-in-law said, "Can we just calm down?" I said, "I am calm." My mother-in-law said, "You are not calm, you are being cruel." I said, "I am being honest. You do not like honesty because it does not make you look good." She said, "You have always been ungrateful." I said, I have always been polite. There is a difference. My husband said, can we talk about this privately? I said, no, she wanted to do this in front of the family, so we are doing this in front of the family. My mother-in-law said, fine. Then everyone should know that you are not the person you pretend to be. You are manipulative, you are dishonest, you are selfish. I said, I bought your house for $60,000 over asking. I paid you in cash. I closed in 30 days. If that is selfish, I do not know what generosity looks like. She said, you bought my house to humiliate me. I said, I bought your house because you were using it as leverage. You kept threatening to sell it. You kept saying we needed to contribute more. You kept holding it over our heads, so I removed it from the equation. Now you have no leverage, now we are equal. My husband's brother said, you are not equal, she is his mother. I said, and I am his wife. That does not mean I have to tolerate being treated like I am less than. My mother-in-law said, I never treated you like you were less than. I said, you told me at a birthday party that it was nice I had a little job to keep me busy. You said this while I was closing deals worth more than your son's annual salary. You have always thought I was small. You were wrong. My sister-in-law said, this is not about you being small. This is about you lying. I said, I did not lie. I kept my finances private. That is my right. She said, you let us all think you were struggling. I said, I never said I was struggling. You assumed I was struggling because I did not brag about what I made. That is your mistake, not mine. My mother-in-law said, you are impossible. I said, I am clear, there is a difference. She said, what do you want from me? I said, nothing, I do not want anything from you. I bought your house, I paid you fairly. The transaction is complete, we are done. She said, we are not done, you owe me an explanation. I said, I do not owe you anything. You got $850,000. You got this condo. You got exactly what you asked for. The fact that you do not like how it happened is not my problem. She started crying. My sister-in-law put her arm around her. She said, you are being heartless. I said, I am being factual. Your mother tried to charge me retroactive rent. I proved I did not owe it. That is not heartless. That is self-defense. My husband's brother said, you could have handled this differently. I said, how? He said, you could have told her it was you before she accepted the offer. I said, why? So she could reject it and keep holding the house over us. So she could keep charging us rent and raising it whenever she felt like it? No, I made a legitimate offer. She accepted. That is how business works. My mother-in-law looked at my husband. She said, are you going to let her talk to me like this? He said, she is not wrong, Mom. She said, what? He said, you did charge us rent. You did raise it. You did try to make her watch the kids or pay more. She is not making this up. She said, I was trying to help you. He said, you were trying to control us. There is a difference. She said, I cannot believe you are taking her side. He said, I am not taking a side. I am stating facts. You sold the house. She bought it. You got a good price. This should be over. She said, it is not over. She humiliated me. I said, you humiliated yourself. You stood up at a family dinner and made demands you had no right to make. You tried to leverage a house you were about to sell. You made assumptions about my finances that were wrong. None of that is my fault. My mother-in-law stood up. She said, get out. I said, excuse me. She said, get out of my home. I do not want you here. I said, fine. I stood. I looked at my husband. I said, are you coming? He stood. He looked at his mother. He said, this is not fair. She said, she is the one who is not fair. He said, she bought your house. She did not steal it. She paid you. You accepted. This is done. We left. My husband did not say anything until we were in the car. Then he said, she is never going to forgive you. I said, I do not need her to forgive me. I need her to leave me alone. He said, she is my mother. I said, and she has been using that to manipulate both of us for years. I am done. If you are not done, that is your choice. But I am not going back. He was quiet. Then he said, what happens now? I said, we move into the house I bought in April. We live our lives. Your mother has her money. She has her condo. She does not need us, and we do not need her. He said, she is going to make this hard. I said, she has always made things hard. That is why I planned ahead. We moved into the house in November. The rental property I bought in April. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, hardwood floors, a backyard. My husband helped me unpack. He did not talk much for the first few days. Then one night he said, I did not know you made that much money. I said, you never asked. He said, I should have asked. I said, probably. He said, why did you not tell me? I said, because I did not need to. We were fine. Our bills were paid. We were saving. It did not matter. He said, it mattered to my mom. I said, your mom made assumptions. I did not correct them because correcting them would have made things worse. She would have asked for more money. She would have expected more help. She would have found a way to take advantage. So I stayed quiet, I kept working, I kept saving. And when she pushed too far, I used what I had built to protect us. He said, "You protected us by buying her house?" I said, "Yes. She was going to sell it no matter what. At least this way I control what happens next. She cannot threaten us anymore. She cannot hold anything over us. We are free." He said, "She does not see it that way." I said, "I do not care how she sees it. I care that we are safe." I had one more thing to say. My mother-in-law did not speak to me for 3 months. My husband went to see her twice during that time. He came home both times looking exhausted. He said she spent the entire visit talking about how I had betrayed the family. He said she was telling everyone who would listen that I was manipulative and cruel. He said some people believed her. I said, "Let them believe her. The people who matter know the truth." In February, she hired a new attorney. This one sent a letter to Martin. The letter said my mother-in-law wanted to rescind the sale. It said she had been under duress when she accepted the offer. It said the LLC structure was deliberately misleading. Martin called me. He said, "This is nonsense." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you want me to respond?" I said, "Yes. Tell them the sale is final. Tell them she had independent legal counsel. Tell them she signed every document willingly. Tell them if they want to pursue this, we will countersue for harassment." Martin sent the response. The attorney did not write back. My mother-in-law called my husband. She said, "Your wife is threatening to sue me." He said, "You tried to rescind a legal sale. What did you expect?" She said, "I expected my son to defend me." He said, "I am not defending anyone. I am stating facts. You sold the house. She bought it. The sale is final. Move on." She hung up on him. He looked at me. He said, "She is never going to let this go." I said, "Then she is going to be angry for a long time." That is her choice. In March, my sister-in-law called. She said her husband was coming home from overseas. She said she needed to move out of my mother-in-law's condo. She said the space was too small for all of them. She asked if she could rent the house my mother-in-law used to own. I said no. She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I do not want your family in my house." She said, "You are being petty." I said, "I am being clear. You stood by and watched your mother try to extort me. You did not say anything. You did not defend me. Now you want a favor. The answer is no." She said, "What am I supposed to do?" I said, "Find your own place. You have a husband with a job. You have options. Figure it out." She said, "You have 2 houses. You could help." I said, "I could. I am choosing not to." She hung up. She did not call again. My mother-in-law sent me a text in April. It said, "I hope you are happy. You have destroyed this family." I did not respond. She sent another text an hour later. It said, "You are going to regret this." I blocked her number. I told my husband. He said, "She is just angry." I said, "She has been angry for 6 months. I am done listening to it." In May, my mother-in-law's sister called my husband. She said my mother-in-law was struggling financially. She said the condo fees were higher than expected. She said my mother-in-law was running out of money. My husband said she has over $800,000 from the house sale. His aunt said she spent some of it. He said, "On what?" She said, "The condo, furniture, helping your sister." He said, "That is her choice." She said, "She needs help." He said, "She made decisions without consulting anyone. She can deal with the consequences." His aunt said, "You have changed." He said, "No, I just stopped pretending everything was fine when it was not." My mother-in-law tried to sell the condo in June. She listed it for $50,000 more than she paid. It did not sell. She lowered the price in July. It still did not sell. She lowered it again in August. She finally sold it in September for $15,000 less than she paid. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment. My husband heard about it from his brother. He did not tell me for 2 weeks. When he finally mentioned it, I said, "Okay." He said, "That is all you have to say." I said, "What do you want me to say? She made her choices. This is the result." He said, "You do not feel bad at all?" I said, "No, I do not. She tried to take advantage of me. I stopped her. She is facing consequences. That is how the world works." He said, "She is my mother." I said, "And she treated me like I was worthless. I do not owe her sympathy." We sold the rental property I bought in April last year. We got $630,000 for it. We used the money to pay off the mortgage on the house we live in now. The house my mother-in-law used to own, we own it outright. No debt, no leverage, no one can take it from us. My mother-in-law and I have not spoken in over a year. My husband sees her occasionally. He says she is still angry. He says she tells people I stole her house. He says some family members believe her. I do not care. The people who matter know the truth. The people who do not matter can believe whatever they want. My hands had stopped shaking months ago. I had been holding my breath for years. I finally let it out. I still work in sales. I am still very good at it. I closed a deal last month worth $92,000 in commission. I did not tell my mother-in-law. I did not tell most of the family. I told my husband. He smiled. He said, "You are incredible." I said, "I know." My sister-in-law found an apartment near the beach. She and her husband are renting. She sends Christmas cards. I do not send them back. My mother-in-law's sister stopped calling. My husband's brother texts occasionally. I respond when I feel like it. The rest of the family has moved on. Some of them sided with my mother-in-law. Some of them sided with me. Most of them just wanted the drama to stop. My mother-in-law lives in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of town. She works part-time at a boutique. She drives a 10-year-old car. She does not have the money she thought she would have. She spent too much too fast. She thought $850,000 would last forever. It did not. My husband offered to help her once. She refused. She said she did not need charity from anyone. He has not offered again. I do not think about her much anymore. I think about the house. I think about the backyard. I think about the fact that no one can take it from me. I think about the fact that I built something that is mine. That is enough. My husband asked me last week if I regretted any of it. I said no. He said, "Not even a little." I said, "Not even a little." She tried to control me. I stopped her. I would do it again. He said, "She tells people you are heartless." I said, "I am not heartless. I am just done being nice to people who are not nice to me." I do not hate my mother-in-law. I just do not need her anymore. She does not get to decide what I owe. She does not get to decide what I am worth. She does not get to decide anything about my life. That power is mine. I earned it. I am keeping it. So did I go too far or not far enough? Tell me in the comments.